This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. It's the 25th of December, Christmas Day, and I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would be doing a podcast on today of all days. I hope you are safe, well and blessed today, and I hope that wherever you are and whoever you are with, you are having a rest or a festive season, or just relaxing and enjoying yourselves and having a good time. This episode is going to be a little bit different in the fact that I'm not going to be doing a regular recording. I thought I would take this opportunity, since it was a special day, to do something different. So with this episode, I'm going to be doing a top 10 of the most listened to episodes of season 1. The episodes that you, my listeners, kept coming back for more and more of. And this is just my way of saying thank you. And I've just put a little snippet of each of these episodes together to form a little mini collection. So this is dedicated to you, my listeners, my supporters, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get underway with the countdown. And we're starting with number 10. And this is from the episode called The Victory Behind Horatio Nelson. The most well-known African sailor to serve as an enslaved and as a free African has to be Olaudah Equiano, who has written extensively about his life as a sailor and incidentally encountered a 14-year-old Horatio Nelson on board the HMS Racehorse back in 1773. This ship, along with another ship, HMS Carcass, were both due to depart for an exhibition to the Arctic in search of a passage to the east. Unfortunately, the expedition had to be abandoned due to both ships becoming trapped in thick ice. Wow, this is one of the things that I just love about my learning journey, about the British Empire. You never know what you are going to uncover. I never would have thought that Olaudah and Horatio Nelson would have even had any type of connection together, but you know, I'm grateful. This is what makes this learning journey about the British Empire so special. Let's move along. We're going from Trafalgar all the way to Hong Kong, and this next episode is at number 9, and this extract is from Anyone for Tea, the Colonization of Hong Kong. So, in this podcast, I'm going to explore and promote discussion around the topic of tea. Yes, that hot cuppa that so many of us make on a daily basis, particularly here in the UK. In today's society, we don't think for a moment why the British are so preoccupied with tea, and more importantly, for the purposes of this podcast, how Britain's interest in tea led to Hong Kong becoming a British colony. Now, colonisation is a twofold process, which involves not only settling in and occupying land belonging to an indigenous people, but also the process of establishing control over those indigenous people. Britain may not have extensively occupied mainland China, but the consequences of its colonisation of Hong Kong has been far-reaching, creating repercussions for British and Sino relationships and Chinese policy perspectives towards Europe and the rest of the world that have affected us globally to this very day. And so there you have it. Who knew that something as simple as a cup of tea could start a whole revolution? And with that tea, let's have some scramble. No, not scrambled eggs, but the scramble for Africa. And so in at number 8 is the episode, The Pink Map Project. The ultimate paradox. From my perspective, the Pink Map Project embodies a paradox. The paradox being European nations felt justified in that replacing one form of exploitation with another seemed to be perfectly acceptable. Freeing the enslaved, then taking possession of their land. It's interesting that the colonisation of the African continent did not begin until after England had outlawed the practice of slave trading in 1807. How did we get to this paradox in 1885? The answer to this can be seen through what occurred in England's history before the abolition of slavery in 1833, and then what subsequently happened after. In at number 7 is one of my favourite podcasts, The Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia. My second reason for focusing on this as a topic for this podcast is because I think that the era of the migration of Africans to Nova Scotia from 1783 can be looked at and explored more closely in how their fight for freedom also feeds into the narrative of the abolitionment of slavery by the British. This migration took place within a major transition where a shift in Britain's attitude to slavery was taking place. Now, I'm going to take a different perspective at this point and focus on the multiple examples of Africans who were actively engaged in the protests and campaigns to abolish slavery by the British. Africans were by no means passive recipients of policy and legislation. Throughout history, they were active participants, instigators, and leaders of many rebellions and uprisings across the Caribbean, America, and the Middle East. You know, I remember doing this podcast. It was such a significant time in my life when I had lost my grandmother several days prior to doing the recording. And, you know, I just dedicate this podcast in memory of her. So, you know, I hope you enjoyed it. Up next, at number 6, it's the episode called Constantinople 1453, a catalyst for European change. How was the seizure of Constantinople an insurmountable problem for European trade? In 1453, a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II, captured the city, bringing to an end not only the Roman Empire, but also the end of Christianity being the major religion for that city, and establishing the religion of Islam as the norm. This young Sultan moved his capital from Edirne in the Ottoman state to Constantinople and established his court there. He not only monopolised trade through the Black Sea, but his armies were able to advance into Europe unchecked and virtually unchallenged. The Turks eventually occupied parts of Central Europe and most of Spain. I encourage you to begin your own learning journey and find out more about this relatively overlooked period in Europe's history. You know, as I started to compile the list for the top 10, you know, it really made me realise that all the popular episodes, the ones that you really love to listen to, were the actual episodes at the start of the series. And, you know, it's really interesting to know that. I mean, as I look back and listen to these really early episodes, I kind of think, wow, I've come a long way. You know, not just as a podcaster, but also technically as well. I kind of think, wow, I need to, you know, go back and polish up the audio a little bit, you know, get it a bit more crisp and clear, and then republish them. So that's definitely something that I'm going to follow up on for next year. Okay, up next at number 5, we've reached the halfway mark, and this episode is called A Call to Action, Macmillan's Wind of Change speech. By 1960, there was also unrest in the Belgian Congo and in Algeria, a French colony in northern Africa. Britain was afraid that this unrest and desire for self-rule, as well as the adopting of communism, would spill into its own colonies. Macmillan's aim was to state that Britain wanted to propose granting independence to many of its colonies, including South Africa, and to encourage majority rule as the ideal model of government within them. Macmillan was also aware that in colonies in which there was a white minority, such as South Africa, these changes would be difficult to accept. So how did Macmillan try to achieve his aims through his speech? From my perspective, one of the ways was through his use of language and its psychological effects. Oh, we are getting real close to the top of the board. We've got our top 4 episodes left, and in at number 4 is the Story So Far. Now, this was the first episode of the Story So Far series, where I decided to celebrate the start of 2021 by introducing and putting a spotlight on what is the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, the poetic narrative. So here's an extract from the first episode. Hope you enjoy. Now, what's interesting about Caribbean Wind is that even though it was the first book to be published, it was actually the last story that I wrote. It wouldn't have been written if it had not been for a conversation while having dinner with a friend back in 2018, who I was sharing my ideas about stories to be told. And she listened intently, and she smiled. She replied, "That's great, Tracy. It's the 70th anniversary of the Windrush in June this year. Are you going to write a story about that?" Honestly, I was totally blindsided by this question, as I hadn't even thought about it. "No," I said. "I hadn't thought about that." Anyway, to cut a long story short, I went home and began working on the story. And I'm going to share with you an extract from chapter 3, and it's in celebration of the Windrush generation. Now, it's funny that we've mentioned H.M. Windrush because, in actual fact, our 3rd episode is the first episode that I ever released. And my goodness, it does take me back to the very, very beginning. It has such sentimental value because it was the first step in what has now become an amazing learning journey for me. So you have placed my first episode at number 3, H.M. Windrush, A Different Perspective. What do we know about the ship itself? Although it is hailed with positive connotations, it actually has a sinister past. Built in Hamburg, Germany in 1930 by Blom and Voss and operated by German shipping company Hamburg Süd, it was originally named the Monte Rosa. The Monte Rosa was a cruise ship and passenger liner used by the Nazis to take Germans on package holidays. These cruises went around the Mediterranean, Scandinavia, and as far as South America. The cruises were part of a propaganda program called Strength Through Joy, promoting the rise of Adolf Hitler and Germany as a superpower. It also operated as a Navy troop ship, and in 1942 it was converted to a prison ship, bringing Jews to Hamburg, where they were forced onto wagons and transported to concentration camps. The ship was captured by the British at Kiel in 1945 and rechristened Windrush the following year in 1946. Okay, we're down to the final 2. And at number 2, it's the second part of our story so far. To be honest, I had a hard time trying to define the genre. It's a story, but they're not fiction. It's fact, but it's a story. It's history, But it's not historical fiction. But the one thing for sure is this: it is poetry and a narrative. So I describe the work as a poetic narrative, and that's how I came to use this term and how I like to refer to them. So this is the next poetic narrative, and this is about the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference of 1884. And so we come to it at last. It's the end of this special podcast episode, and it's the number one podcast episode of 2020, presenting to you none other than Wind of Change Expanded. The speech coincided with a visit made by Macmillan to Britain's African colonies in 1960. It was the first time that a British Prime Minister had made an official visit and tour of its African colonies, and it wasn't just about publicity. It was for a specific purpose, which was twofold. Firstly, many African colonies had fought on behalf of the British government against the Axis powers during World War II, and were angered and resentful at the fact that they had not been rewarded for their services, as Britain had promised. This resulted in a growing feeling of nationalism and a desire for independence away from Britain. Secondly, in the same year, South Africa's then Prime Minister, Dr. Verwoerd, announced a referendum to take place in South Africa to determine whether there was interest in breaking away from Britain and becoming a republic. Both these issues worried Macmillan. So there you have it, folks. Our top 10 podcasts of Season 1 of Stories to be Told. Thank you so much for spending just a little bit of your time on Christmas Day with us. And as always, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in these podcasts. Let's continue this learning journey together. We have got so much more in store for you in 2022, and I hope that you will continue with us. If you are new to Stories to be Told and this is the first time you're listening in, welcome. Here is your top 10 podcasts to get you started. And if you are a committed listener, welcome again, and thank you once again for your continued support. And just remember, you know what to do. Visit Stories to be Told, like, share, follow, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in 2022, as well as on the next page. Bye-bye.